So shall we start? Okay, I'm Jack. I publish as Jacqueline Romero. People call me Jackie or Jack. My friends call me Jack. I am currently part of the Center for Current and Emergent Quantum Technologies in Australia, and I was chief investigator of the Center for Engineered Quantum Systems, also in Australia, which just ended. And before I forget, I will thank all the sponsors the last few years, because as you know, science doesn't happen without money. So we thank those who fund our curiosity. Okay. It is the International Year of Quantum, so I feel obliged to show this picture of some maybe happy physicists, but it's not obvious they're happy. There is one woman there, Marie Curie. She won the Nobel twice. This is maybe how we think of physicists now. I always challenge when I give talks to students or to the public, I'm waiting for the project that will look at the correlation between physics enrollments and Big Bang Theory. I don't know if it's a positive or negative correlation, so I wait with much excitement. If you're bored, that's some data to mine for you. Okay. We'll be together for 8 hours, so I feel like I should introduce myself properly. So I did my undergraduate in the Philippines at the University of the Philippines. Then in 2008, I went to Glasgow in Scotland, where I stayed for 7 years. We are PhD students, so I unearthed some PhD pictures as well. That's me on my first day of PhD. I came to my group without a laptop because I don't have money to buy a laptop. I said, where do I get a computer? They told me, oh, you can use the boss computer. So that was actually my PhD supervisor's Mac there that I'm using. That's us midway. I think that's 2010. I was showing him some results. I think that's my first PRL paper, I think. That's me before my Viva. Like, who here is doing their PhD in the UK? Like Viva, yeah, it's such a special time. I don't think I will ever talk to somebody in as much depth about what I do ever. So that's Steve Barnett. That's my second supervisor. That's Miles Paget. They're both now at the University of Glasgow. Steve is a theorist and Miles is an experimentalist. So maybe that's why I speak both languages, because I have to understand both of them. And that's my Viva day. That's John Rarity, who you maybe have heard if you were paying attention. So he was my Viva examiner, actually. So that was 3 hours with John Rarity. That was super fun. I cried out of joy afterwards. I was so embarrassing. Like, he shook my hand and I cried. But it's such a special time. So congratulations in advance. Enjoy your Viva or your public examination, although that sounds a bit more scary. That's my graduation. I took a picture in front of my setup, which, as you could see, is not so complicated. And then I finished my PhD. I stayed for 3 years in Scotland as a postdoc, and then I went to the University of Queensland in 2015, where I have been ever since. Okay, so for those who don't know where that is, this is the University of Queensland. It's a campus in Brisbane. We have a river. Like, I know some people are from Brazil. I have heard from Brazilians it is like Rio. I have never been, so maybe judge for yourself when you are in Brisbane. So we are in like a peninsula that's, bounded by the river. That's the physics building there. There's some relief sculpture. That's the Tower of Pisa, and that's a Schrodinger's cat there, although that's not very obvious. It's a special building because it houses the pitch drop experiment. Who has heard of the pitch drop experiment? Yes, running since 1927. We are approaching our centenary year. It's an experiment. For those who don't know, it's an experiment proving that tar is liquid and not solid, although it looks like a solid. So we have been counting the drops that has fallen since 1927. We are currently at the 10th watch. So 9 drops have fallen since 1927. We're waiting for the 10th. If you ever get bored or you feel like what I'm gonna do is too easy or too complicated, I won't even bother. There is a live stream of the 10th watch for you. Okay, so you have my blessing to just watch the pitch drop experiment. Okay, so that's my current group at UQ, QDITS at UQ. I have 3 PhD students, some honors and masters, a website which I should update. And most importantly, I have 1 postdoc position available. So if anything I talk about today sounds interesting to you and you're maybe looking for a job sometime in the near future, talk to me. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna start with this Google trend, which is comparing qubit and QDIT. Just in case you can see the QDIT, it's the red line here at the bottom. Okay, so as you can see, QDIT's not doing very well in terms of the awareness maybe, but it has been improving in the last few years. I just put an arrow for when my group started, although I don't tell them to search for QDITs, although there seems to be some correlation. So I think there has been increasing interest. I don't know why that is, but I think it's good for business. So I hope some of the things I talk about today would be interesting to you. Now, these are my interests. I have been drawn to quantum mainly because of quantum foundations and quantum technologies. So a lot of what I'll talk about today, I think they're very much in the quantum foundation space. I do QDITs because I started as a classical optics person in the Philippines. I do optical field manipulation, like really making the laser into shapes that can trap, that can do microscopy. So it's all very classical. And when you've been exposed to that, you'd think, why, if all these are possibilities, why is quantum qubit? When, light is just a collection of single photons. So maybe we can do QDITs with photons as well. So that has been that's been the theme of my research. But outside science, as Rod mentioned, I have other interests. So science communication is one. I really try to go out there and talk about the science that I do. I think it's very important, especially in the times that we live in. Even if people are not scientists, I think they should know and respect the scientific method. You cannot disagree with facts. And I hope more people know that, especially the ones who talk in front of UN. Science diplomacy is another interest. So science diplomacy, I see standards as science diplomacy because when you're there, you actually talk to a lot of people from different countries. You try to negotiate and agree. I am I'm actually chairing the International Basic Sciences Program Advisory Board of UNESCO. And that's a new role for me. If you've ever heard of open science, open publishing, like of course we know open publishing, right? So that has been a big push for UNESCO a few years back. Like what happens is there's a recommendation and then gets put forward in a General Assembly. Countries agree that, oh, that's a good idea. Of course, it's non-binding, but there's the expectation that if you agree to it, you'll do something about it. And I think that's what has happened with open publishing so far. Okay. So Arthur has already said this, but I'm gonna say it again. Information is physical, it's carried by physical systems. And That's why I am a physicist, because at the very bottom of everything, there is physics in the physical systems. And if you have a different physical system, like in quantum, you have different rules. And that's what makes it really very interesting. So today, I'm gonna spend, I don't know how long, maybe the next 1.5 hours to tell you about some physics. So I'm gonna introduce DITs and QDITs. And again, this will be, I didn't know the composition of the group when I was preparing the talk. So I'll just, if you think it's so low level, think of it as an exercise in science communication. That's important too, okay? And then I'm gonna delve into some communication tasks, and it's formalize what communication tasks mean, and maybe try to extract from that what's the difference between DITs and QDITs. And then I'm gonna introduce entanglement, and again, it's gonna be science communication exercise, maybe for a lot of you, but I hope you can learn something from it as well, because talking about entanglement is a tough gig. If you've ever done it in a public talk, it's hard. But I think the last public talk I did, from which I got these slides, actually worked. So I hope you get something out of that as well. And then I'm going to introduce high-dimensional entanglement, because it's not as much explored as qubit entanglement, but we have very similar techniques to show high-dimensional entanglement. And then finally, because I am a photonics person, I'm gonna just comment on entanglement and non-separability, because there is a lot of work that talks about classical entanglement. Have you heard about that term? Classical entanglement? Yeah? So I just want to clear up the terminology a bit and maybe operationalize what that means. Okay, so I'm going to start with DITs and QDITs. So we all know what the bit is. It's zeros and ones. Of course, we have analog signals, current, and all that, but we threshold, so we get the bits. That is the simplest classical system. Classical system with 2 states, that's the bit. We could have used coins, but that wouldn't be so efficient. In quantum, we talk about spins. If you want the more physical model, maybe the spinning of electrons, but those are the qubits. We write it as a superposition of vector 0 and 1, and we call it psi. For, I don't know why, but we call it psi usually. So the DIT is just an extension of that. So DIT is a classical system with d possible states. And you would be very familiar with that because we all use the alphabet, right? Nature, for some reason, in, I don't know, 4 billion years of evolution, has come up with a 4-letter alphabet in our genetic code, GATC. I actually got this picture from a National Geographic article. There's a startup company that's trying to use DNA, artificial DNA, to store all the data that we have, because there is a lot of data and DNA is a more efficient way of storing all that data. And that has some, according to this article, has some advantages, like it has a longer lifetime. For as long as you keep it away from oxygen and light, it's gonna last forever. It's also more energy efficient. So I don't know, we'll see if that works, but I think that's exciting. Okay, in quantum, we have naturally QDIT systems. One example is the ions. So when you look at ions, you have ground and excited state, and there is the harmonic, like the harmonic oscillator. So you could treat each of those levels as a QDIT. I think this is, so you can write QDIT as a superposition of d vectors. So we just extended the qubit. I believe this is the record for a trapped ion qubit these days. So that's from University of Waterloo, Crystal Senko, in barium ions. So they have a readout. So they can prepare and measure 13 levels in trapped barium ions. I think that's cool. The noise, I think their biggest problem is actually magnetic field noise, not the availability of levels. So yeah, let's wait and see what they're gonna do with that. My specialty is light. So I use photons to make qubits or qudits. So you're all familiar with polarization. It's two states, horizontal, vertical, wavelength and frequency. We use that a lot in modern day communications. Time bins, I've met some people working with time bins. So that's really just when did the photon hit the detector. My expertise is on transverse modes, which is these fancy shapes here. When you solve the wave equation, you will get to families of solutions, and those are an orthonormal set of modes that you can use for your qubits. So the ones here are Hermite-Gaussian from Hermite-Gaussian family. You might have heard a lot about Anton Zeilinger, who works in OAM, like he calls it, twisted light. So I've done a lot of work on that as well. But I like calling it shape because it's really not just OAM. It's a lot of shapes. Maybe just before we go further, I just wanna differentiate between matter and photonic quantum, because I have been to meetings where I feel like I'm talking with somebody and we're not understanding each other, and then reflecting on it, I think it's because we are talking about matter and photonic like they are the same systems. And I agree at the logical level, they are all the same. Like to a theorist, they will be matrices, vectors, it's all the same. But especially if you are an experimentalist, it's good to map that distinction, okay? So I think of matter, when I say matter, so what are the examples? Spin, superconducting, qubits, ions, neutral atoms, they're matter, okay? The qubits, they are fixed in place. So like when Google talks about, we're gonna make a quantum computer, we are actually gonna make our superconducting, like the transmons, they are on chip. They are fixed in place. And what happens in the computation is you have time-dependent controls that you turn on and off. And the art is finding out what those controls are, right? So in a way, they are closer to conventional silicon computers because, you know, they are here. The qubits are there. A photonic quantum computer, like photonic quantum information processing unit, doesn't have to be universal quantum computer, works a bit differently. So we are using photons or electromagnetic field. It doesn't have to be like discrete Fock states. And what you have is you have a network of interferometers or waveguides, whatnot. You have that structure, and then you've got the photons or pulses of light that's moving through. Okay, so the qubits themselves, they are not fixed in space, obviously because you can't stop the photons. So it's like you have a network, and then the qubits, they're passing through. The entangled qubits, they are continuously created and measured. So actually, if you ask me how many qubits do I need for the photonic quantum computer, my answer is I don't know. It depends on what algorithm you want to do, right? Depends on how quickly you generate your entangled states. So in a way, a quantum technology that is based on photonics will be closer to an all-optical network. It will look very different from your quantum computer that's based on ions or atoms, okay? And that leads to a lot of subtleties, which we will not discuss today, but keep it in mind next time you are talking with somebody, okay? So as I've said, so when Google says they're going to make a quantum computer, they're physical qubits, they live on the chip. For photonic, when PsiQuantum says we're going to make a quantum computer, the physical qubits live and die all the time. They generate photons, they measure the photons, generate photons again, measure the photons again. It's a different paradigm of computation. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Okay, so that's my aside, matter versus photonic. So now for photons, you can choose whether you want to do qubits or qudits. A lot of us do qubits. And there are some, so I made this table just to differentiate between qubits and qudits. I put the tick mark for when I think the qudits are better. So example, information capacity, of course, qubits win because you have more information carried by the photon, right? One qubit will carry 1 bit per photon. A qubit will carry log 2d bits per photon. And in terms of noise tolerance, when you calculate the quantum bit error rate that your QKD system can tolerate, those are usually higher for qubits. So I think so you've got the reference there. So it's about 18 to 20% for Q quarts compared to 11% for qubits. I'm going to talk about Bell inequality violation today. The Bell inequality violations, they are also stronger and more robust for qubits. So I think that's all points for qubits. Now, so I put an X where it's bad and I can't do anything about it because the math just tells me that's it. I can't do any better than that, okay? So for example, detector requirements, obviously you need D detectors per basis for a qubit. So that's more than you need for a qubit. Loss resilience, the information capacity is a double-edged sword. If you lose a photon, you also lose more information. So it works both ways. And again, I can't do anything about it. But I think there are some things that are engineerable if we are, more creative, maybe. So one metric is hardware complexity. Obviously, qubits are more mature. They're relatively simple, but that doesn't mean don't use qubits. It just means I have to design better interferometers. I have to improve efficiency and maybe design as simple as I can. So I put, I don't know, a geeky emoji because I identify as a geek. Like, I don't know, maybe you do too. Okay, experimental maturity, obviously qubits are very mature. There are already commercial QKD systems. For qubits, this is the longest that I have seen, a 145 kilometer transmission of a Q-quart, which actually is impressive. Integration potential, of course, qubits are, I don't think materially that there's a difference. You just have a sweet spot for qubits. Like obviously, I will not make a 20-dimensional qubit on chip, right? Like I think that's gonna be a nightmare to control and measure and all that. But again, in the same way that for some reason nature ended up with a 4-alphabet genetic code, maybe there is some sweet spot for qubits as well. And so that's what I mean when we talk about integration potential. I don't think we have explored it as much in terms of cost-benefit analysis, but I don't think we will go very high either. I think in practice, it will just be moderate values for D. Bill mentioned networks and repeaters. Obviously, it's very well studied for qubits. I haven't seen a lot using qubits. I think it's gonna be interesting and perhaps fruitful actually, because if you're gonna use atoms or like a condensed matter system as your memory, there are a lot of levels there that maybe you can interface with higher levels in a photon as well. So it's a lot of things to think about. So I put this slide here because you might think they're negative, but actually I think these are engineerable things that needs more science and engineering and computer scientists and mathematicians. Like it's a systems kind of problem, which I think is interesting to solve. Okay, so now I'm gonna start with really very basic things. First, define what is D. D is the number of simultaneously distinguishable states. So you could think about it as the number of orthonormal states in one basis. And we already know this. If you have a pure state, you can just represent that as a vector. If you have a qdit, so if you have a dit, it's a vector. Qdits is a superposition, and you have the probabilities there given by the mod square of the probability amplitudes. Okay, so we all know that. Now, dits and qdits can also be mixtures. So one subtlety is that we don't say it often because it's like everybody understood that we fix an orthonormal basis. But after fixing an orthonormal basis, you can write a density matrix. So the dit will look like that. You have your diagonal there, and it will respect probabilities, of course, and some mathematical properties, namely the density matrix should be Hermitian, non-negative, and its trace is 1. Okay? For dits, the off-diagonal elements are 0, but for qdits, we have coherences. So for a superposition like that, for a qtrit, that's your density matrix. The off-diagonal elements are called the coherences, although that's not usually used actually, but yeah, those are the coherences. So the dit in this matrix then corresponds to the restriction to use pure states in some fixed orthonormal basis and their mixtures. So if you think about it, the dit space is really in the qdit space, because the dit will be where you have the non-zero, you have the 0 of diagonal elements. And you can write the density matrix like that. It's gonna be a pure state if there's only one value for, one non-zero value of P, okay? I put this as an exercise just to wake us up at this point, but let me check my timing. I made a schedule of my talk, so I'm gonna, okay. Maybe you can solve it without writing anything. Okay. So if I have a density matrix, can you see that? Is that, yeah? Okay. Density matrix that is did you actually bring paper? Do students still bring paper these days? Yes. Okay, so that. And again, maybe some of you will look at it and know the answer to the question, but let's just try to wake you up. 0 minus. Okay, so my question is that density matrix a maximally mixed state? Can you understand my writing? Yes, okay. So look at it, that's a density operator or density matrix. I use the term interchangeably. It's a density operator. Tell me, is that a maximally mixed state or not? Okay. It is a mixed state. Definitely. Is it maximal? Okay, let's try. Sorry? It's not? It doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like it. Let's see. What did okay. And I'm sorry it's gonna be tedious, but I'm gonna write it out for you. I will not complete it because we don't have time.
Like 2/3, which are from 0, so it can be maximal.
Plus 1 plus 33 1. Yep. I'm just copying my finished product here in my notes. Is it? It is? Is it? Can you see it now? Uh, 1 0, yes, minus 0 4 1. Okay, I think that's enough. 1 3. Just check. 1/3 0 0 minus 3. Oops. Minus. Okay, maybe it's easier to see if it's here. Okay. Okay. So you can actually simplify that to this, right? It's gonna be who tried it? Okay, so if you simplify that, you will actually get a maximally mixed state. It is actually maximally mixed. Okay, so what's the? I just wanted to do that simple exercise to emphasize that when theorists, you could tell I have spoken to a lot of theorists. when we say mixed state, a maximally mixed state, it actually corresponds to an infinite number of ensembles. And as an experimentalist, I can choose what are the measurements that are convenient for me, right? So I can actually represent my mixed state into an ensemble that is convenient for me. And that is a subtlety that is lost in, maybe more often lost than not. So, okay, moral of the story, there are an infinite number of ensembles for one mixed state. So yeah, dits and qubits. So I hope we're clear with dits and qubits. I'm gonna go now to to the next section. Was there a question? Yes.
How do you know, like the example that you gave just now, how do you know that is exactly what you share? Because those are numbers.
Sorry, how?
Like the example that you gave just now.
Yes. Right. I just got that from a textbook.
No, like as in the numbers that you gave just now, it's like written down on a piece of paper. I understand that. And you can represent anything from your machine to like whatever value you want. I'm just curious, because I never did any of these. Like, how do you know that's exactly what you prepared?
It's a mixture. So if I have a machine that can prepare a set of states, I can, and it's a mixture, so I do runs, I do shot by shot. So it could be as simple as shot by shot, I'm gonna toss some coin that is biased such that I prepare each state with that probability. And in practice, actually, that's how At least in our system, that's how we prepare a mixed state. Okay. Okay. So the next bit is on communication tasks, like just an operational way of looking at communication tasks. But before that, let me just put us all in the same grounding on measurements. So QDIT measurements can be projective or not projective. The projective measurements, you can think about it just like as reading one DIT from your QDIT, okay? It's a projective measurement. One QDIT can encode one bit of information. So you've got there your projectors. The phi's are an orthonormal set of states. And if you look at all the probability, and the probability of measuring a value, measuring J is given by the trace of the product of the density matrix and the projection operator. Okay, so the number of projective measurements, because they're orthogonal, they cannot exceed the dimension D. More generally, though, you can have what we call positive operator value measurements, and J can be greater than D. But the probabilities are calculated in exactly the same way. It's the trace of rho. Sorry, I switched my notation, but it's the same trace of rho times your POVM. And the set of POVMs also follow some mathematical properties. They're Hermitian, positive, and if you sum through them, you should get the identity. But some elements of your POVM can be non-commuting, and that leads to interesting things. Okay, who has heard of this? Maybe you have heard of Neymark's dilation theorem. I think we do it all the time, but we don't call it Neymark's dilation theorem. I am an experimentalist, so I'm fascinated when I have these, when I read these things. So you have projective measurements, you have POVM. Now, Neymark's theorem says that the outcome of a POVM can be simulated by a projective measurement, but that projective measurement has to be in a higher dimensional space. Maybe as theorists or computer scientists, you do it all the time when you dilate, but that's the theorem. So when you have a QDIT in a lower dimensional space, you can find some ancilla that you operate some unitary onto it, and then when you do a projective measurement on that, you get the result of the POVM in the lower dimensional space. So I thought that was interesting. I think quantum error correction people use it all the time without saying what they're doing. Okay, so now I want to go to communication tasks, which I apologize, I just wrote on sheets of paper, but I'm gonna. It's actually a fairly recent paper from Mark Hillary. Do you know Mark Hillary? He's a quantum optics person. Yeah, and he was in the first summer school that I went to. So I thought, oh, what is Mark Hillary doing now? So I just Googled, and then I found this paper of his in Contemporary Physics, where he was trying to formalize DITs versus QDITs, which I thought was interesting. So I want to share that with you. And the way they look at it is in terms of communication tasks. There's minimum error communication task. There's communication of uniform partial ignorance. Have you heard about that task? No? It's very obscure and doesn't sound useful, I must say. And then if we have time, we'll go to the random sequences with non-overlaps, because the third one is actually what has been used for some quantum digital signatures. Okay. So I'm gonna use the board now. Not board, but let's see if we do, this will work. Okay. Okay. So I'm sorry, I'm gonna copy my notes as I speak. Hopefully some processing will happen as well. Okay, so I wanna talk about Q bits and bits in terms of communication tasks. Okay. Number one sounds useful, minimum error communication. Okay, minimum error communication. So the task is to transmit X, which is gonna be an element of, ABC using a bit. Okay, and your promise X is drawn uniformly. So equally likely to be ABC, okay? Of course, we have Alice and Bob. Alice and Bob are the communicating parties. And they agree on an encoding-decoding strategy before their task, okay? So it can be as simple as, so encoding and decoding agreed before, encoding, decoding, agreed before the task. So, okay, so for example, Alice can just encode A to A0 and B to A1 and then C to A0 again, okay? So you see the problem now? There's gonna be, Bob will never get this perfect, like he'll never get this perfect because there is not enough, there's not enough bit for the symbols that they want to transmit, right? So as expected, the success probability is 2/3, right? It's easy to see because you only have a bit and you want to transmit 3 characters. In general, the success for this game is D/N. Okay, so where D will be the number of simultaneously distinguishable states of your physical encoding, and then N is the number of symbols that you want to transmit. Okay, so using a bit. Now, what can you do if you have a qubit, using a qubit as encoding? So for each possible, okay, so this is bit, this is qubit. Okay, if you're gonna use a qubit, I can put my qubit in some density matrix, right? So for each encoding, for each, okay. Okay, so it's just X. I'm gonna assign you as density matrix X. And then the decoding is an N outcome measurement. I don't need to specify it. I just know there's going to be n outcomes. So I'm going to represent that as some measurement m. Okay? So now I have a qubit, I have a quantum state, represent that by density matrix. I define a decoding, which is some measurement m. I can calculate the success probability. Let me just check my time. Okay. Okay, the success probability is, I'm gonna put minimum error communication subscript, okay. 1 over n summation of x equals 1 to n of trace. So I'm just applying the formula that you saw earlier in my slide. That's the success probability, okay? Now for a fixed measurement, the best encoding will be where you've chosen your decoding. The best encoding will be when Bob measures, the eigenvalue that he measures corresponds to the X that Alice prepares, right? So I'm gonna just write that as, for fixed M, the best encoding is such that, one where such that, one where the trace of rho x mx will correspond to the largest eigenvalue. So this is the largest eigenvalue. Okay. And then you can apply your math. I'll just get to the result because it's not very interesting, the derivation. What you'll get is that the success probability, so you, yes, okay. Actually, so the success probability that you get, I think this is easy enough for you to derive, so I'll just write. So using that, the success probability that you get is less than or equal to d over n as well. Okay, so what you do is you sum over the largest eigenvalues, put the trace inside the summation, and then you'll find that it's also d over n. Now, the interesting thing here for me is that the success probability that you have for a bit is d over n. And the success probability that you have for a qubit is also Mach-bounded by d over n. So for a minimum error communication game, for a minimum error communication task, you don't get any advantage using a qubit. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah, yes?
The ABC are the basis?
The ABC are symbols that you just want to transmit. So it's not, well, each of them can correspond to the outcome of a measurement. Each of them corresponds to an outcome of a measurement. You could think about it like that.
Which alphabet Alice wants to send if she does sets one with this that?
So if she wants to send an A, for example, oh yeah, yes. So the question is, what are ABC? So ABC are the symbols that you want to transmit to Bob. Now in practice, you would encode that in a way that if I send this system, say a quantum system, to Bob, if he measures on that, it should be A that he gets. So it's you could think about it that way. Okay, so minimum error communication task. So the moral of the story is that if your objective is to minimize error, you don't get an advantage from using a qubit. So now I'm gonna go to what sounds like an obscure task, but I think is actually interesting. Communication of partial ignorance task. Okay, so what's the scenario? There's a referee. There's a referee who chooses again one of n symbols, and n is again greater than d. Okay. Yes. And then the referee, so now we're adding a third person. There's referee, there's Alice and Bob. Referee chooses one of n symbols, and then the referee is a bit evil. So the referee then chooses one of the n-1 remaining symbols. And tells Alice that. Okay, so the aim of the game is for Alice and Bob to guess the referee's choice. Okay, so Alice will transmit to Bob some information, and then Bob will try to guess. Bob will try to guess what the referee has chosen. Okay, so here you have, we can calculate the probability easily, right? The Alice, if a referee tells, so let's just say I have 3 cups here labeled A, B, C. Okay, so A, B, C. If referee tells Alice A, Alice knows that A is not what the referee has chosen, so she will choose between B and C and tell that to Bob. Okay, so the probability that they will guess this, so I'm gonna write that as probability of partial ignorance, is 1 over n-1, right? That's, I hope that that's very clear. Okay, so now they can, that's the maximum probability that they'll win this. But they can agree, so they'll play the game, they'll agree on an encoding. Say the encoding is, if referee, okay, let's just call the characters R, A, and B. Okay, referee, there's Alice, and there's Bob. Okay, the encoding that they choose is such that if referee says small a, Alice sends 0 to Bob. And for any other symbol, Alice sends 1. Okay? So what will Bob do? So if Bob receives 1 from Alice, say if Bob receives 1, he guesses A. If Bob receives 0, then he makes a random choice. He makes a random choice. Let's just keep it to A, B, C, between B and C, okay? And here you have a bound. So the bound that you have does not depend on the dimension, right? Like note, it's not independent of the dimension. Okay. So that's communication of partial ignorance. I did not invent the name. I think it's a Finnish also actually. Finnish and Mark Hillary named it that. Okay. So let's make okay. How are we for time? It's been an hour. Do you want to stop here or do you want to play the next game? Let's play the next game. Okay, let's just make it more interesting. Okay. Okay. I have here the 3 symbols. Okay. So say the game is, let's make it more interesting. Let's introduce a prize. Okay, I have here a Mozuku rice cracker. Okay. Ooh, yes. Okay, so the referee will choose to put this rice cracker on some cup labeled by the symbols, okay? But I'm gonna talk to, just for the sake of practice, say you're Alice, I'm gonna tell you some symbol that's not B, okay? So the referee always tells them where he did not put the rice cracker, okay? And so in this encoding decoding strategy, if you send 0 to Bob, so if Alice sends 0 to Bob, you will guess between B and C, okay? If you receive 1, you guess A. What?
Let's say you send me 1.
You send Alice. So the referee tells Alice some symbol that is not where the rice cracker is.
It's Monte Carlo game.
It's you can think of it as a Monte Carlo game. Yes, it's 1/n-1. Okay, but here's where it gets interesting. If you are doing this over and over, because obviously I have lots of rice crackers, okay? I have lots of rice crackers, and you will notice, the referee will notice that Bob guesses A more often than any other character. So say you have, okay, or maybe this is a bad example. Let's say I have another cup, another cup. If you have more symbols, and your decoding is such that your encoding decoding is such that if the referee says A, send 0. If it's another symbol, send 1. You will notice that Bob is always saying A. So what you can do, what the evil referee can do, is to never put the rice cracker in A. Yeah, he will never get, so they will fail all the time. So the ignorance, which was the ignorance of Alice and Bob, which is uniform, to the referee, it doesn't look like uniform ignorance. Do you get the Get the difference? So in a game where it should be uniform, it's uniform ignorance because you actually don't know where the rice cracker is. But if the referee observes and you're always guessing just because of the nature of your encoding and decoding, he is guessing, he is seeing that you're always saying that symbol, he'll never put the rice cracker there and you'll never win the game. Okay? So in games like that, that's where quantum is actually useful. And in my next talk this afternoon, I'm gonna show you a game where that can be useful. Okay, I think I'm gonna end there because that's about an hour now. Let's do, I don't know, a 5-minute break. Let's do a 5-minute break. And then I'm gonna finish this. I'm gonna come to the communication matrices and then entanglement. Okay? Who gets the rice crackers? I actually have lots of rice crackers. So you can. Yes. So you can. SN0, we have a ABCD, SN0, A or B. So that's actually like their, that's another game. That there's a decoding like that. Yeah. But there, even then, they show in the paper that that can be beaten by a quantum encoding. Yeah, maybe we don't have time for it actually, but you can read the paper. It's actually really. The name of the paper is this. I don't think it's this one here. Contemporary Physics. Yeah, the journal is Contemporary Physics, and can a qubit carry more information than a DIT? Okay, I think I'm gonna shorten this section because I want to get to the high dimensional entanglement part. It's interesting, Bill. Okay, so I'm gonna introduce the communication matrix. Who has heard of communication matrix before? Maybe it's called by another term. But anyway, I met it reading Hillary's paper, so let's just do it. Communication matrix. Okay, it's got a simple definition. Let's do, okay. The elements of the matrix is just the probability that. So it's a conditional probability that Bob chooses J given the referee given referee says I. Okay. I think it's gonna be clearer with an example. So I'll just write the communication matrix that will optimize this game that I described earlier. So A3, let's call it A3. So essentially you want, I'm gonna normalize 0, 1, 1, 0. And then 0, 1, 1. Okay, it's different from the matrix. If you think about the minimum error communication matrix, it's gonna look something like that, right? Because if you just want to transmit the correct information, you got all the ones in the diagonal. Here you have something like, if the referee chooses this, you want Bob's measurement to be equally on the two other states, okay? And again, I did not name this. It's called, states that allow you to do this are called anti-distinguishable states, or like measurements. Okay, so anti-distinguishability is what our mathematician friends call it. Okay, so you can represent communication tasks in terms of communication matrices like this, and you can look for the optimal QDIT implementation of those communication matrices. The optimal, I'll just write the properties. So, communication matrix has an optimal QDIT implementation if there are n QDIT states and measurements, which are POVMs, with outcomes 1 to n, okay? Such that so I'm just gonna write OI and J, and for every I that's not equal to J, the trace of rho I, actually, every I equal to J, the trace of rho J. Okay, so you can do whatever you want. When you find a communication matrix, you can look for the measurements that will satisfy this. Then you have your optimal implementation. I'm gonna go to my, maybe, okay. So I'll just leave you to read the paper, but I'm going to show you what are those states, what are those measurements for qubits. Like, do you recognize these ones? Like those states on the Bloch sphere? Like, they actually, if you've heard of SIC POVMs, symmetric informationally complete POVMs, those are your anti-distinguishable states. And they will be the optimal implementation of the game that I just told you earlier, where you want to send something to Bob that if Bob measures it, he gets what you did not have in mind equally among the other options. Okay? So when you have a game that needs that, you will win with qubits and QDITs. And I will leave you to read the paper, but there are really interesting things there about like whether there are optimal implementations for different values of n, for different values of d. So like, for example, one interesting thing that I thought, one thing that was that you can bound the dimension of the QDIT that you need or the DIT that you need for a communication matrix. And you will find communication matrices where these two are different. So the classical dimension is different from the quantum dimension that you need. So if you are interested in high-dimensional quantum information and looking for something more interesting than qubits and entanglement in qubits and all that, I think this is where you maybe want to look, because there are subtleties with the different dimensions. There are a lot of open questions there. Okay? I'm not going to talk about 3, but I'll leave you with that. It's in the paper. So third is a game which is useful for quantum signatures. It's, say, for example, you've got Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Alice wants to be able to authenticate to Bob and Charlie, but Bob and Charlie, you don't want them to be able to authenticate with each other. So what you need is a string which will say, you want a string that will not overlap with either Bob or not overlap with Charlie. So Alice doesn't want a string that doesn't overlap with Bob or Charlie, but Bob and Charlie doesn't have these properties on their strings. So again, for that, it will be useful to have this anti-distinguishable encoding. And there's a quantum digital signature example that they have in that paper. Okay. So with that, I'm gonna now launch to the entanglement part, which is not this kind of entanglement, although, Bill, do you drink wine, Bill? This is a really nice Napa Valley GSM. Because I haven't been to the Napa Valley recently. I need to go back. But yeah, if you like wine, that's really good. Okay, so entanglement, obviously, we love entanglement. It has won a Nobel Prize in 2022. When I was a PhD student, I always brought a camera with me, and I took pictures of people. I didn't know they were gonna win the Nobel Prize. I just took pictures of them. It was 2014, so it was sort of the 50th anniversary of the Bell inequality. So there was a big part, not big, I think it's kind of big. There was a party in Vienna to celebrate that, and they were all there. So I paparazzi'd my way. Oh, Mary Bell is the wife of John Bell. Unfortunately, he passed away, so Mary Bell was there. This is the one with the socks. Like, what's the name of that guy? Broltman's socks? Okay. Yeah, that's him. The one who never wore same color socks. Okay. So I want to talk about entangled photons, and I'm going to describe entanglement in 3 ways. What we call entanglement are correlations that escape classical common sense explanation. And I say escape because someday we might catch it, but right now it's escaping us. Okay, so this is the experiment, a thought experiment, which I often give when I give talks. So say you have Alice and Bob, and you give them 2 boxes. The promise is that the boxes will contain balls that are of the same color. They will go into separate rooms. And obviously when Alice opens the box and sees there's a blue ball, she will know right away that Bob has a blue ball, right? Because the promise is they will have the same color. You can repeat this experiment over and over. You get blue, blue, red, red. You can do that experiment over and over. You will have a correlated list. But that's not like there's nothing strange about it, because from the moment they left the room with the 2 boxes, the colors of the balls were like already there, right? You were promised it's gonna be a blue or red ball, and they're ordinary balls, so they have their color in them. When you have a quantum, an entangled pair, and you do this experiment, so you have the quantum objects, the promise is the same, the color is gonna be the same. If Alice measures red, Bob will also measure red. It's gonna be the same, right? You end up with a correlated list. There's nothing different from the previous thought experiment with ordinary objects. But now the interesting thing is that correlation comes from the superposition that was in your entangled objects. Okay? And I'm saying this because when I met entanglement as a younger, not so wise student, I thought the correlations were actually the interesting part. But what's actually interesting is the origin of the correlations rather than the correlations themselves. Okay, so entanglement, I'm gonna write it more formally. It's superposition of superpositions. Have you heard that phrase before? Entanglement is superposition of superpositions. Okay, so entanglement, we already know superposition, of course. We've met the qubit, which is a superposition of 0 and 1. So in this case, I just assign red to 0 and blue to 1. If I now have an entangled pair, and I'm gonna write subscript 2 and 2 because I wanna say how many parts there are and how many outcomes for each of the measurements, okay? So when I have an entangled state like that, and I was promised the balls are gonna be, I was promised that the colors are gonna be correlated, and you have a superposition of 0 and 1 for each of the balls, and they're correlated, right? Each is in a superposition, and entanglement is just the superposition of those superpositions, okay? So you can describe it mathematically like that. You can write out all the vectors and tensor products. It all looks very, very nice, okay? 2 qubits is a Q-part, okay? So superposition of superpositions. Now what's interesting is that philosophically, it's very challenging because it's like the state of one part can no longer be separated from the other part. So say, okay, bear with me because this is a thought experiment without drawings, okay? In addition to color, say you can also have shape in the quantum object, okay? So Alice and Bob can choose to measure either color or shape. If Alice and Bob both choose to measure the same property, okay, they choose to either measure both color, both shape, they will always get correlated results. But if they choose different measurements, say if Bob chooses to measure shape and Alice measures color, Bob will see random results. He will see either a ball or a cube, and vice versa. So now you are in a situation where the state of Bob's object cannot be separated anymore from what Alice has chosen, from what Alice's measurement is. And that's what that non-separability has no classical counterpart, right? Because why would the color or shape of an object that's over here depend on the choice of the measurements and the outcomes of something that's over here, okay? So there's no classical counterpart to that non-separable phenomenon, and that's what we call entanglement. And that's what some people have exploited here. Like, did you see this? You can get, literally, you shine your wedding ring with SPDC photons, so they are now entangled, and then you give that to the couple getting married. If that's something you want to do, you come to me. I will charge you less. Maybe even free if you tell me a good joke. Okay? So that's non-separability. So the history, Arthur already gave us a taste of the history. I'll just maybe rehash that a little bit. So it started really with 1935 EPR. So because in the thought experiment with the color and shape, right, you are in a position where you cannot actually predict what the results will be if Alice and Bob chose different measurements. That is inherently unpredictable. And Einstein was not happy about that because he thinks that a complete theory should let you predict with certainty. So he's talking about this reality in this 1935 paper. So looking for a theory to complete quantum mechanics. Bell in 1964 came up with an answer to that paper. He tried to complete with local hidden variables. So he tried to explain local hidden variable. He tried to explain quantum correlations using local hidden variables. It's got 3 reasonable assumptions, which I will summarize as realism. You know, measurements are determined by hidden variables. The variables exist prior to any measurement, to any experimental situation. Locality, results on one location are independent of any measurements or actions on another location. And freedom of choice. You know, Alice and Bob can choose, like can choose freely what measurements they want to perform. And what this paper has shown is that if you've got those 3 assumptions, those assumptions are incompatible with the predictions of quantum mechanics. Okay, so local hidden variables will not allow you to predict the results that quantum mechanics predicts, okay? I'm just flashing here the original Bell inequality because it's not usually what we use. People say Bell inequality all the time, but actually the original Bell inequality, this one, is not experimentally testable because it needs perfect correlations between A and B. And that's not well, I guess you can do it, but I think that's very hard. So actually, it's testable in that it is testable in principle. In practice, it's hard to get that perfect correlations. So what CHSH did was to introduce another setting. So if you see here, there are only 3 settings for the measurement. What CHSH did was to introduce another setting, so that's 4, and then you get rid of the perfect unrealistic correlation. And when we talk about Bell's inequality now, this is usually what people mean, the CHSH version. So Bell's inequality, you have these entangled particles. There are 2 measurement stations on separate locations. They're just choosing measurements, making statistics from many measurement outcomes. If you look at the predictions of quantum mechanics for the correlation, you'll find a sinusoidal curve, but the local hidden variables predicts a triangle wave like that. And where you have the differences, like the biggest gap, that's where you measure the maximum violation. So from correlation measurements like this, you can get the S parameter, which should be greater, which is bounded by 2 if you have local hidden variables. Quantum mechanics predicts, of course, it's 2 square root of 2. That's what we often call the Chirelson bound. Okay? So the experiment, the first experiment was actually by Clauser, not Aspe. But Aspe did, so what's the difference between the Clauser and the Aspe experiment? So the way I see it is, Clauser had 2 detectors, only had 2 detectors for 4 possibilities. And you know, it is very reasonable to say that if the photon is not horizontal, it must be vertical, right? So I mean, in practice, I can live with 2 detectors. But what Alain Aspect did was actually to collect all the possibilities. So he had 4 detectors. And I think that's why we talk about his experiment more than the Clauser experiment. But the Clauser experiment was actually the first one. Like, that's the sinusoidal curve. So what we get from all the experiments is that local hidden variable theories cannot explain the quantum correlations, and quantum correlations agree with quantum mechanics. It might be interesting to some of you, there's also Jason's theorem. He said all entangled pure state of 2 qubits violate a Bell inequality. So the Bell inequality is a very strong test of entanglement. Okay, I added this slide because Arthur was talking about post-quantum correlations like the Chirelson bound. So I have here Bell parameter S, and you see the y-axis? It goes up to 4. So that is a Bell experiment that we did. We got Bell parameter up to 4. the coincidence curves that we got were not sinusoidal. They were like squarish waves. When you get an experiment like that, either you think you have discovered new physics or you did something wrong with your experiment. Okay? It will not surprise you that we did something wrong with our experiment. Actually, we intentionally did something wrong. What we did was, I'm gonna let you read the paper, but the gist is that those measurements are happening in a higher dimensional space. And we were not accounting for that. So I don't know what that means philosophically, that you can get S equals 4 and squarish correlations when you ignore the higher dimensions. But I thought that was interesting, so we put a cautionary tale in case you do an experiment like that. Yes? This post-selection in the sense that you only, oh no, these are just joint, photon detections. So depending on how you define post-selection, like it's post-selection in that we don't know, and we didn't measure the photon, we don't know. But it's a joint projective measurements. That's what we did. But there was something funny with the way that we designed our analyzers. Okay, so another aside. So photon was actually a controversial word, and when it came out in 2022 in a Nobel citation, I was very happy about it. Because Willis Lamb, another Nobel winner, actually wrote an article called Anti-Photon because he thinks that it is misused by a lot of people. People should have a license to use the word photon. I do think I have a license, like, it's a lot of work to do a PhD. If you ever face like discussions like that, I still meet people who don't agree with the word photon. There is a very nice introduction in Rodney Loudon's book, The Quantum Theory of Light. And he even talks about Lamb, actually. So the word photon, for me, operationally, if my detector clicks, there is a photon. That's the photon. Whether you need the quantization to describe different phenomenon is, of course, very subtle. But as an experimentalist, if my detector clicks, there's a single photon. That's the single photon. So operationally, at least, there is a very clear definition. Okay, so now I want to go to high dimensional entanglement. I wrote an article about this in Optics and Photonics News. If you want to know more about it, high dimensional entanglement can mean two things. One, many qubits. 2 qubit states are the Bell states. So like psi plus, psi minus, phi plus, phi minus, those are the Bell states. And local operations on 1 qubit get you from one Bell state to another. Like, we know this. For systems that have more than 2 qubits, it's not usually the case that local operations bring you to the other n-entangled state. So for example, for 3 qubit states, you've got the GHZ state and you've got the W states. So we actually call it W state because it was discovered by Wolfgang Durr and Vidal and Sirac, but I don't know why he won. It's called W states. But I just want to honor the other 3 authors. Okay, so for 2 qubit entanglement, there's only the Bell states. You can go from one to the other with a local operation on 1 qubit. For 3 qubit states, that's not possible. You cannot go to a W state from a GHZ state. So those are 2 different types of 3 qubit entanglement. I'm not gonna do the exercise now because we don't have time, but I have a question here. You see here the 3 qubit entangled states are these ones. Which one of them is resilient to loss. And when I mean resilient to loss, if I lose one of the photons, will I still get an entangled state? 50-50 chance of getting the correct answer. Okay, I see W, GHZ. Okay, GHZ, W. No, you're too scary. Okay, so the W state, so write it out. What you do is trace out the third qubit, okay? Trace out the third qubit, and then look at the resulting state of the remaining 2 qubits. In one of these, the resulting 2 qubit states will still be entangled. No, actually, the W state is the one that's resilient to loss. And just do it as an exercise. It's quite fun. Okay. The other thing that's interesting with many qubits is it's in a way a stronger demonstration of non-locality. I don't think I have time to do it for you, but I will not derive it, but let me just summarize it. When you do a Bell experiment, you're showing the non-classicality by doing many shots of the experiment, right? Because you're building statistics when you're doing a Bell experiment. With a 3-qubit state, like a GHZ, you can do one shot of the experiment, and there you go, elements of reality are disproven in one shot of the experiment. So you don't need statistics to show that local hidden variable theories are incorrect when you do it with 3-qubit states. If you want to know more about it, that's actually a work by Mermin. He wrote, I think it's a Physics Today article, like Goodbye Elements of Reality, something like that. I thought that was interesting. So in one shot of the experiment, a GHZ state can disprove local hidden variable theories. Okay, so we have the 3-particle entanglement. We have 4-particle entanglement as well. So it's a PRA 2002 paper. There are 8 or 9 types of 4-particle entanglement. So you see it gets very, very messy quickly. This is a picture from a Putrid superconducting person, I think, where they map like just a Lord of the Rings kind of map. What's the state of entanglement in different dimensions? So you've got your Bell states, qubits, and then you've got multi-particle, multi-dimensional, where we actually don't know a lot about. So I'm going to tell you about 2 qubits mostly, because more qubits is hard experimentally and in theory even. So when you have more than 2 qubits, actually when you have 2 or more qubits, sometimes it's actually hard to certify the entanglement, because if you do quantum state tomography, the scaling doesn't work. You need to do a lot of measurements. So often you need entanglement witnesses that will put a lower bound on the dimensionality and will also tell you whether it's entangled or not. So one of the entanglement witnesses we use for high dimension is called the CGLMP inequality for Colin, Jasan, Linden, Masar, Popescu. They recast Bell inequality for higher dimensions. Schmidt decomposition, we've heard of the Schmidt decomposition before. Yes, so it's when you have an entangled state and you have orthonormal basis U and V, that's the Schmidt decomposition, where you have the optimal correlation. That's the Schmidt decomposition. And R is the rank of the Schmidt decomposition, is the number of the non-zero coefficients. I was speaking once with an engineer, and I felt like we were talking about the same thing, but he calls the Schmidt decomposition SVD. And I have since confirmed that I think it's some flavor of it. Like Mina is doing that. Like it's kind of like it. from an engineer's mind. So I'm just putting that there. The dimensionality of the 2-qubit entanglement is given by the Schmidt rank. So do a Schmidt decomposition, the rank will be the local dimension of your of one particle. So you have d by d entanglement. CGLMP inequality deals with this kind of scenario. You've got two parties, choice between two measurements, and you've got the d outcomes. So it's the same experiment, you share the entangled pair, and then you've got choices for Alice and Bob. So either A1 or A2, B1 or B2, each with D possible outcomes, okay? So it's very much like the Bell experiment, except that now instead of 2 outcomes, you have D outcomes. Now the joint probability of outcomes for Alice and Bob, so actually, okay, I'll just write that, okay? So you can, the quantum prediction, you can write in terms of the measurements and the state that you have. So we just applied what we learned earlier about measurements and density matrices. That's the joint probability. So Alice measures I, Bob measures J, given they chose A and B respectively, okay? And then you have the local hidden variable prediction, which is just this, where you see again the local hidden variable distributions. So CGLMP, actually I'm gonna show you not the original CGLMP because this one's more elegant, I thought. So CGLMP, if you look at the original paper, I think their inequality was, I don't know, 4 lines. This one is a newer CGLMP inequality, and I like it because it's just 1 line, okay? But they defined this quantity here, which is just, it's sort of like an ordering, really. So you do your experiment, you list all the outcomes, you check this inequality, and then you have your CGLMP inequality, okay? So probability A2 less than B2 is a probability that the outcome that Alice gets is less than the outcome that Bob gets, and so on, okay? So when you do that, you have an inequality. Now the next question is, what are the states that maximally violate the CGLMP inequality? And this is a conjecture. As far as I know, this has not been proven, but this is what was in the original paper. This is what was in the original paper. Numerically, when you have an inequality like that, what you can do is actually look at all the possible entangled states, look at all the possible measurements, and just choose the states and the measurements that will violate your inequality. And that's what this paper has done. So what they've done actually is do that numerical search and then come up with the different states and the different violations for every dimension. It looks like the states, the optimal states earlier still holds. They're the optimal states. But interestingly, the optimal state is not the maximally entangled state. In qubits, what violates the Bell inequality the most are maximally entangled states. In qubits, what violates the CGLMP inequality are the non-maximally entangled states. So here are just the Schmidt coefficients. Maximally entangled state, this should all be the same value. Here you have different values. So what it's telling you is that when you go to higher dimensions, there's really a very clear separation between entanglement and non-locality. And I think that's interesting. And what you can also see is that the violation, so what we are trying to violate is 1, right? It has to be, 1 is the bound. As you go to higher dimensions, the violation actually increases as well. So in a way, if I'm an experimentalist, I want to do that experiment because that would be more robust against whatever imperfections I would have. Because there's a bigger there's a bigger gap between the classical and the quantum. Okay, so I hope I convinced you CGLMP inequality is actually has something to say about the non-locality and entanglement in nature. Okay? I think I already said that non-maximally entangled states violate CGLMP better. So you're in a position where when you're talking about qubits, maybe it's hard to distinguish non-locality and entanglement. When you go to qubits, they're very, very clearly separated. Okay, so that's an entanglement witness. CGLMP inequality is an entanglement witness. There is also a dimension witness because now we have to also say what is the dimension of the entangled state. I mean, why would that be interesting? Because as you could see, if you are in a lower dimension, the properties of the entanglement are different, right? Like in a bell, in qubits, all the entanglements the same. In higher dimensions, it's not. So it would be good to know what that dimensionality is. Okay? How are we for time? We have 5 minutes left. Okay. I'm gonna... So this is an experiment. This is how do you bound the dimension? Because the CGLMP inequality has different violations for different dimensions, you can do it in a device-independent way with CGLMP. So CGLMP inequality is a device-independent dimension witness because you have different amounts of violation for different dimensions. If CGLMP is hard to do, you can do something easier, and this is what this dimension witness is, but this requires you some knowledge of the state. If your state maybe looks something like this or close to it, you can do measurements in two bases, these two, and you can get the fidelity with respect to what you think is the state. And using that fidelity, you can bound the dimension of your entangled two qubits. So the details of the paper are in this paper here, but just in practice, I like this paper because you measure only on this basis and this basis. There you're doing just projective measurements. And with that, you can bound the dimensions. Okay. I think I'm gonna finish maybe 3 minutes later. Let's see. Okay, there was one, or actually, maybe I can stop now and then continue later. Because okay, who here works with qubit or qubit systems that have more than 1 degree of freedom that's accessible? And when I mean accessible, like you can, like for photons, right? You can measure either polarization or time or transverse modes. Like for some systems that's hard, but for photons it's quite easy. So I wanna delve into the subtleties of those systems as well. Okay, so I'll do that when we come back.
So okay. There is one thing that there are hyperentangled states. There's a Bragg regime in like neutral atoms. So in theory, we have worked on generating hyperentangled states. So they kind of have more degree of freedom, like they are entangled in more than 1 degree of freedom.
Hyperentanglement.
Yeah, so they have internal states and external states.
So I'll talk about it.
Okay. I worked on superconducting qubits, so there's a state leakage noise in those qubits. So if you go to more than 2 dimensions, there's a state leakage issue. I've like Googled, so on OAM, it is also an issue, but I don't know, is it feasible with high dimension, or like how can you control that?
With photonic qubits, like OAM, for example, like we have measured entanglement of up to L equals 10,000. Like that's a Zeilinger experiment from, I don't know, 10 years ago.
Also, OAM is kind of classical, something classical kind of, not exactly like, so it's in a special domain.
So Okay, so let me go back to your superconducting question as well. So superconducting qubits are actually Q-trits that you ignore the higher levels of. It's a harmonic oscillator. You ignore those that are not the two states. So how, if you want to control that, I think it's going to be hard. Like, who here works with superconducting qubits? Like, you know, it's hard, but it's possible. With photons, it's a bit different because when I generate high dimensional entangled photons, the dimensionality is actually defined by a nonlinear process. I'm going to talk about it in the next session. I'll show you some entanglement experiments, and I'll talk about the nonlinear optics a little bit. Yeah, but the generation, yeah, it's easier with photons. That's why I do photons. Okay, let's break.